Canton, China, 1856. Angry yells and curses and threats fill the air as your men drag the mostly Chinese crew of the Arrow onto the ship's deck. You are a Mandarin tasked with keeping order in Canton, a thankless job in these dark times. China is racked by civil war. The Taiping rebels are gaining ground, bringing with them war, death, and destruction. Amidst the chaos, bandits and pirates seek plunder. Just like the motley crew of former rebels, pirates and thieves on the Arrow. One with a pockmarked face, the black teeth of an opium smoker, tattoos, and an angry-looking scar under his neck, glares at you and spits onto the deck, while the foreign devil captain tries to talk his way out of this. Just as you are giving the order for them all to be arrested, another ship appears, flying the British flag. What do they want? An official with those ridiculous whiskers the barbarians seem to favour boards the Arrow and demands that you release this crew. You point at the tattooed, scarred opium smoker. Are you really claiming him as one of your own? This is a British registered vessel flying our flag. You have no authority here. Exasperated, you demand, where is this flag? Show it to me. They were not flying any nation's flag. It soon turns into an escalating shouting match. Something inside you cracks as he calls you a filthy heathen. You slap him once in the face. There is silence. Then he yells that you will regret this and storms off. You try to put the matter from your mind, but little do you know the consequences of your actions. That slap and the arrest of the Arrow's crew will be used to justify another war, one that will reach all the way to the imperial capital of Beijing before it's over. I'm your host, James Martin. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
damals uns ausgebildet und wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome back. In this episode, we'll be covering the Second Opium War. Like in all good sequels, everything will be turned up a notch compared to the First War. It will be bloodier and more destructive, while France and even America would join in the fun. Despite excuses offered up to justify it, such as spreading civilization and free trade, it would also be a much more naked grab for the profits the poppy could bring. China, in 1856, had entered dark times. The quality of the emperors was declining. For all the faults of the Daoguang emperor who met in the First Opium War series, he at least tried to solve the mounting problems of his kingdom. His son and successor, the Xiafeng emperor, was pretty useless by comparison, a weak-willed drug addict who had little time for the day-to-day business of government, preferring to spend it in bed with his favourite concubine, Xu Shi, while drugged out of his mind. Xu Shi was far more impressive. Already, she had begun to dominate his court, while after his death, she would effectively rule China for the rest of the 19th century. With the emperor enjoying his concubines in an opium-induced haze, the imperial court was distracted by the Taiping rebellion. After failing the civil service exams, Hong Zishan, like many a student, retreated to his bedroom. Unlike other students, he emerged from said bedroom claiming to be the brother of Jesus Christ. The revolt he started would kill 10% of China's population before it was done. With China weakened, predators began gathering. Despite victory in the First Opium War, Britain was still unsatisfied. The British public were addicted to China's tea and silk, and a huge £9 million trade deficit had opened up. Only opium sales were stopping a vast river of British silver pouring into China. There was a problem, however. Opium was still technically illegal in China. The questions for the British government, therefore, were firstly, how do we get China to legalise opium? Secondly, how do we sell more of the said opium to them? One man thought he had the answers: Harry Parkes. Britain's acting consul in Canton and possessor of a fine set of mutton chops, he was a young man in a hurry who believed it was his destiny to open up China. He was looking for an excuse for a war, and he thought he had found one when imperial officials seized a ship called the Arrow. Claiming it was a British registered ship, he raced to the scene, earning a blazing row and a slap in return, as we saw in the dramatisation at the start of this podcast. According to the British, the Arrow was crewed by hard-working British traders and was proudly flying the national flag until sinister mandarins yanked it down and illegally arrested the crew. In reality, it was a former pirate ship crewed by the scum of southern China and was serving as a floating warehouse for stolen goods. A neutral Portuguese sailor confirmed the Arrow hadn't been flying any flag before it was boarded. Also, its registration as a British vessel had run out months ago, so even if it had been flying the Union Jack, it wouldn't have had the legal right to do so. And Parkes knew all of this. Along with his ally Sir John Boring, Governor of Hong Kong, Parkes demanded a public apology and the release of the Arrow's crew. To back up his threats, he seized what he thought was a Chinese warship to act as hostages. However, the blundering duo had actually seized a private ship with no connection to the imperial government. Still, the Chinese released the prisoners, but refused to apologise. Over the lack of an apology, for an instant where it was in the wrong, Britain went to war. A British fleet advanced up the Pearl River, effortlessly destroying Chinese forts along the way, until it reached Canton, where it began bombarding the city. Parkes had thought this would be an easy war. However, he had not reckoned with the stubbornness of the Chinese governor of Canton, Yi Ming-chen. Yi was a grumpy and obese mandarin who had a thankless job. He was already trying to crush the Taiping Rebellion and had become infamous for executing tens of thousands of Chinese. The last thing he wanted was a war with the foreigners. However, when it came anyway, he was not going to back down. Greatly angered by repeated shelling of his headquarters, he put a bounty on the British, announcing in an edict that "Use all means at your command to assist the soldiers and militia in exterminating these troublesome English villains, killing them wherever you meet them, whether on shore or in their ships. For each of their lives that you may thus take, you shall receive, as before, $30. Parkes finally had the war he wanted, but it wasn't turning out quite the way he had imagined. Shelling Canton wasn't getting him anywhere, while Yi came up with some crafty ways to attack the British. Fireships filled with explosives were released under the cover of darkness, forcing the British fleet to temporarily retreat. He also used terror attacks worthy of a Bond villain. Let's pay a visit to the ill-fated passengers of the Thistle, a steamship heading up the Pearl River. You wipe the sweat from your brow as the hot South China sun beats down. Still, it's cooler being on deck rather than inside the steamship. Plus it gets you away from the crew. You can't put your finger on it, but there's something off about them. They're all smiles and bows, but you can feel their eyes following you everywhere. As you admire the Chinese junk sailing past, a crewman approaches and in broken English asks you to go to the dining room. He is smiling, but you notice that it doesn't reach his eyes. When you reach the dining room, all the other Europeans are already there. Suddenly, the doors are slammed shut. The crew begin taking off their clothes, revealing Qing military uniforms underneath. You demand to know what is going on, but no one answers. Instead, they draw their swords and advance. There are no smiles now. The Thistle was later found drifting and on fire. In its hold was the gruesome sight of the headless corpses of every European passenger on board. The entire crew, and even some of the Chinese passengers, were actually Qing soldiers. Yi was delighted when they brought him the passengers' heads for their rewards. As fighting raged around Canton, America would have its very first clash with China. While it was neutral in this war, its traders and the ships that protected them were still very prominent in the war zone. Perhaps mistaking the Stars and Stripes for the Union Jack, a Chinese fort opened fire on an American ship and decapitated an American sailor. In retaliation, 4 Chinese forts were shelled and then stormed by US troops. The Stars and Stripes were triumphantly raised over the last fort captured. America would shortly return to neutrality, but it wouldn't be the last time in history American Chinese forces would fight. Not by a long shot. Shortly after this, an incident took place in Hong Kong that would terrify its British community, leaving behind a mystery that is worthy of a Sherlock Holmes novel, the Ah Lum affair. On the 15th of January 1857, around half of the European population in Hong Kong fell ill with nausea, vomiting, stomach pain, and dizziness. It was discovered that the bread they had consumed from a local Chinese bakery had been poisoned with large amounts of arsenic. Thankfully for the victims, the dose of arsenic was so high that it caused them to vomit up the poisoned bread, saving their lives. While no one died, Hong Kong descended into panic. The owner of the bakery, Chong Ah Lum, was caught in Macau and put on trial, but he was found not guilty. Even today, we do not know if it was an accident, sabotage by a rival bakery, or a plot by Qing officials. The European residents of Hong Kong only knew that they'd come close to being massacred. Inevitably, the blame fell on Yi and the Chinese community. From now on, the Europeans would get their bread from a British and trustworthy bakery. Well, British at least. The owner was regarded as one of the greatest villains Hong Kong has ever seen. If it was a Qing plot, it backfired massively, as we shall see. With the war stalemated, Parkes and Bowring had sent urgent requests home to the UK for a larger force to bring China to heel. However, news of their actions had deeply divided Britain. The opium trade was still very controversial, and many opposed it on moral grounds. The pretext for war was also pretty flimsy. Britain was fighting because a Chinese official refused to apologise for something he wasn't in the wrong about. Once again, the anti-opium forces girded their loins for battle. Their target was someone we had met before, Lord Palmerston, a legendary Lothario and statesman. He had been merely Foreign Secretary during the First Opium War. Now he was Prime Minister in his own right. Attacked by the opposition and even by members of his own government, Palmerston was on the back foot. The famous radical Richard Cobden angrily proclaimed that the government of England are bullies to the weak and cowards to the strong, tabling a no-confidence vote in the government. After 4 days of tough debates, Palmerston lost. It seemed as though the war would soon be over. However, not for the first time. His opponents had underestimated Palmerston. He went to the people and called an election. British elections are rarely ever influenced by foreign affairs, but this one was solely about the issue of whether to wage war on China. Pro-war newspapers were filled with images of Yi ripping down the British flag on the Arrow, while Palmerston falsely claimed that the heads of respectable British merchants had been displayed on the walls of Canton. It was having an effect, but it wasn't enough to win. Then, like a bolt out of the blue, news of the Hong Kong mass poisoning reached Britain. The pro-war newspapers had a field day. This is just an example of the coverage. This hideous villainy and unparalleled treachery of these monsters of China. Noxious animals, wild beasts in human shape, without one single redeeming value. They even faked a letter where Chong Ah-lum confessed to working for Yi. Makes you glad our modern media doesn't indulge in such sensationalism. Palmerston won a huge victory. The Second Opium War had truly begun. Every sequel aspires to be bigger and better than the original. This time, Britain wouldn't be fighting alone. France was eager to join in. Unlike his famous ancestor and namesake, Emperor Napoleon III was relatively pro-British. The two great rivals had recently fought together in the Crimean War. The official French reason for joining the conflict was the murder of one of their missionaries. Auguste Chapdelaine had been illegally preaching the good word in the Chinese interior. When he was caught by the Qing authorities, he was brutally tortured and locked into a small iron cage that was suspended near the gate of the prison he was being held in. His death had provoked a shrug of Gallic shoulders at the time, but was now turned into an outrage for which China would pay. The real reason that France went to war was that they didn't want British merchants gaining a commercial advantage over French merchants. For now, though, operations were unexpectedly delayed. In far-off India, the jewel in the crown of the empire, local Indian soldiers had mutinied and risen up against British rule. Reinforcements meant for China were rushed to India as British rule hung by a thread. This left the new commander of the expedition twiddling his thumbs for almost a year. Lord Elgin had already had a distinguished career in the Empire, serving as governor in Jamaica and Canada. He was an intelligent and sensitive man who disliked the opium trade and was unsure about the whole legitimacy of the war. Yet by the end of this conflict, he will commit one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism in history. More on that in the next episode. With the Indian mutiny under control, Elgin finally got the troops he'd been promised. The next step was to attack Canton yet again. The British and French fleets pounded Canton's battlements. Then their soldiers waded ashore and raced to the walls with scaling ladders. Let's head there now. A wave of Chinese lead greets your regiment as you run towards the walls of Canton. The heavy scaling ladders and fierce fire are not your biggest worry, however. There is a bet, over whether the British or the French will reach the top of the walls first. You'll be damned if you'll lose money to a Frenchman. One of your comrades stumbles and falls, clutching his chest, but still you race on. Finally, you're at the walls of Canton, but so are the French. Frantically, you climb up the ladder, dodging rocks thrown by the defenders, as a bullet ricochets near you. Finally, you reach the top. Looking back, you see that you have beaten the French by just one man. A Chinese defender charges at you with a sword. You dodge the attack and smash your rifle butt into his stomach. He falls off the battlements with a scream. As more British troops arrive, you savour your triumph. Napoleon will be paying for your drinks tonight. Canton fell, and the victorious army rampaged down the rather inappropriately named Avenue of Benevolence and Love. Government buildings, including a Manchu palace carpeted with bat dung, were then occupied. Then the soldiers got down to the serious business of looting the entire city. Elgin recorded in his diary that, "My difficulty has been to prevent the wretched Cantonese from being plundered and bullied. There is a Hindi word called loot, which gives, unfortunately, a venal character to what would, in common English, be styled robbery." As much as Elgin condemned the looting, blaming most of it on the French, of course, he wasn't above joining in. The city treasury of 52 boxes of silver, 68 boxes of gold ingots, and the equivalent in taels of £500,000 was plundered and sent to India in lieu of official reparations. Imperial wars could be a very profitable business, if you were lucky. Harry Parkes, however, was seeking a different kind of treasure. He wanted his old enemy, Yi. He had disappeared, but the British were hot on his tail. Eventually, the stout Mandarin was caught trying to unsuccessfully escape over a large wall. Yi's fate would be a sad one. He was exiled to Calcutta in India as a guest of the British. He became good friends with his neighbour, the former King of Oud, another ruler who had been deposed by the British. While they didn't speak each other's language, being screwed over by the British seems to have been enough to bond them together. Yi would never return to his beloved China, dying a year later from illness. One of China's richest cities was now under foreign control, and would remain so for the next 4 years. The Emperor, or more likely his advisors, were in no mood to give in. More force would be needed, so the fleet headed north. Their target would be the 5 Taku forts that guarded the entrance to the Peiho River. From here they could threaten the imperial capital of Beijing. This time around, taking the forts was relatively easy. Make a note of that. This time. The Allied army advanced to Tientsin and met no resistance, though embarrassingly, Lord Elgin was mistaken for an opium trader by the local Chinese officials. The Emperor caved in, and the Treaty of Tientsin gave Britain and France most of what they wanted. However, the legalization of opium once again wasn't discussed, mainly because of Elgin's views. When Elgin left China, he must have thought his work was all done. So far, this seems like a pretty short and not particularly bloody conflict compared to the First Opium War. However, it wasn't over yet. This was just a prelude before the main event. The Emperor had no intention of ratifying the treaty. Delay after delay after delay occurred, frustrating the British and French. In particular, the Emperor and his court would not allow foreign ambassadors to be stationed in Beijing. with the Taiping Rebellion still raging on in the background, and actually a far more important conflict for the emperor and his court. They were determined to keep the foreigners out, if only because they feared that such a blow would destroy the remaining prestige of the monarchy. The war would continue. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, leave a comment, or tell a friend. In the next episode, Britain suffers a humiliating defeat and the war bursts into life again. Bloodshed, treachery, and rampant looting follow hard on its heels. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.